Mehr-Afarin Kohan. I'm reading today from my short story, The Sounds of Jilotzingo. It was somewhere in the mountains of Jilotzingo, Mexico, that my mother raised both arms to the sky and screamed. She screamed like the ravens circling above. She screamed so loud, I thought the dry earth already cracking under my sneakers would gape open, like when earthquakes hit Mexico City or Tehran, both cities built on fault lines. It was a week into our vacation in Mexico, and my father still had not acclimatized to the heat. So we left him napping in the shaded rental car, perhaps dreaming of the snow we left behind in Toronto, and started our hike along a flat, sandy road. The path turned uphills through sharp volcanic rocks, interspersed with fierce, gigantic cacti, then narrowed into rough trail with wilder, overgrown shrubs and spiky flowers that scratched our ankles. The dry wind of Jilotzingo picked up vigor as we climbed higher, whipping my mother's skirt into such a frenzy that it restrained both her legs. To keep herself from falling, she forced one knee out through a gap between the flaps of her skirt and leaped forward. But I still needed to anchor her arm, her skin slipping from my sweaty hands. I had never seen my mother break down. All my life, she was fine. Once we had to wait in line under the smoldering sun for hours, and she kept me under her skirt for shade. She said she was fine, even when my father had to apply Vaseline that night to her burnt shoulders, even when she dove into a lake so freezing that her kidneys ached. She said she was fine. It was October, a Canadian October, and I shrieked when my toes merely skimmed the lake's surface. Seeing her body sink deeper into the blue, I thought she was a mermaid, withering under the sun or shivering in icy waters. She was always fine, unbreakable, until she broke. Arms towards the sky with all the air she had collected in 40 years of walking on earth, from Iran to Canada to Mexico, passing through deserts and lakes and mountains, she screamed. I could hear all the air exiting her lungs, the hot and cold and dry and humid air. Then she brought her palms together to pray, sinking to the ground. God, why do I deserve this? She pleaded. God, take this bee from inside my head. I'm begging you to let it be silent again. I'd never seen my mother so full of disdain for religion pray to a God she didn't believe in before. When her symptoms first began last year, I imagined the real bee stinging her brain, its buzz resounding inside her skull. When she banged her temples, I waited for a bee to exit from her ear, until my father said a word to me that I needed to look up in my parents' nursing textbooks: tinnitus. Your mother has been through a lot in her life, my father had said to me. Be a good girl to her. So now I'm going to move to a different section of the story, somewhere in the middle. So here there's more information about her relationship with her father that I'm skipping, and also a little bit of a background about where the parents came from. But I'm going to move back to the mother's background again. Emancipated from my boring high school in Thornhill, I was enamored with Mexico. It was full of music and happy people and color. But my mother saw only the ragged and the ugly. Ah, what do you know about the world anyway? She barked at me, contempt gathering in her lips and teeth. But what she hated the most were all the noises. Noises so loud they were hard to hear. Blasts of roadwork, roar of motorbikes, coughs of rusty bus engines, laments of street accordion players, howls of hungry dogs, shrieks of ravens tearing apart stray hatchlings. She dreaded the most the woo of the wind that wailed like a crowd of anguished women and children. It was not easy for me to see my mother on her knees in that way. God is also for desperate people, I suppose. God could be for when tired legs can no longer hold a skirt flapping violently in the wind. I never knew God. So once when I fell from my bike and my wrist was stuck in the direction it's not supposed to ever go, I cried out for my mother, looking up to the sky as if she would descend from the clouds with her arms outstretched and eyes wild with worry. And she did come, not from the sky, but from the end of the street, running with her knees so high I thought she was going to turn into a horse and gallop. I told you to be careful, stupid girl, she barked at me. And then she gathered me in her arms, her voice immediately softening. Oh, my little peanut, it's going to be okay. Look what you did to your poor wrist. She held my wrist in both hands and gasped and neighed and cuffed me lightly at the back of my head. Now her praying to the clouds sounded stupid because I was old enough to know that nothing and no one would ever be descending, and old enough to know something had broken in my mother's backbone forever. So the story continues with information that the grandmother, the mother's mother, has passed away, and that mother did not have the chance to visit her. And that was the beginning of the tinnitus for her. And eventually she returns to their father and they are able to bring the mother back to the car. And so now I'm going to read the last paragraph, the last bit of the story. It was decades later, as she shrank on the hospital bed, skinnier than the dried leaves, when she thought I was her mother, speaking to me in a language that neither my father nor I could understand, that I recalled our Mexico trip. Inflicted with the same amnesia she harbored, I had held on to the fabricated version of her that was now eroding in front of my eyes. It was unmasking a suffering that had crystallized in her inner ears long before my grandmother's death, long before I was born even, longer even than the time she fled her birthplace as a young woman, a decade into the revolution. I hesitated to ask about what the sounds of Jilotzingo had triggered in her. When I did, she stared at me with hollow eyes and babbled like she was sinking into ominous waters. It was as if she was not my mother anymore, and I had not exited from her womb, but from another woman I knew nothing about. This other woman resembled a wet canary in the rain as she tried standing up on the hospital bed despite the nurses pulling her down by her floppy arms. Even when restrained by leather straps, she puffed her chest up, raised her chin, and stretched her neck like she was about to sing her loudest song ever, but no sound ever came out.
Thank you, Afarin. That was really beautiful. And we loved this story. This story is fiction, but does it have any resonance in real life?
Yes, thank you for that question, Danielle. So the story is ultimately fictional, but the idea of it actually comes from my relationship with my own daughter. So I have a six-year-old daughter who was born in Toronto and is growing up here, which is a very different experience than where I grew up. So I was born in Tehran, Iran, and I lived there until I was a teenager, and then I moved to Canada with my family at that time. So my childhood and my past is vastly different from what my daughter is experiencing. And I find myself, trying to protect her from what I consider to be a traumatic past for me because of my experiences in what I consider an extremely patriarchal society where I grew up, and it's almost dystopian. And while I see myself as a fairly resilient person, there was a time that I wondered, can I really hide the broken parts of myself from her? And what does she see when she looks at me? So the story was inspired by imagining my daughter as the protagonist writing about her mother.
That's absolutely fascinating. I had no idea when I read it, but it really does make sense. Our theme for this issue of BLR is body politic, how our bodies and our health intersect with society. And I'm wondering how do these themes reflect in your story?
Yeah, when I first saw the theme of your of this issue, I thought, oh, shows up quite a bit in my writing. Actually, body politics shows up quite a bit in my writing, and I would say partly consciously and partly unconsciously. In this particular story, bodies come to bear the scars of the past trauma. What we see in the tinnitus, for example. But they also communicate the trauma in a silent form to the next generation. So specifically in this case, from the mother to the daughter. So while the language cannot bear to articulate the pain, the body carries it and communicates it. But also in this story, the bodies are also passing on the resilience and the perseverance. And there are two major animal metaphors that the mother is often described with that I think kind of encompasses both of these. One is the bird, and that you saw at the end, that you heard at the end, that the bird that tries to sing but cannot. And the other one is of a horse, an animal that never gives up, keeps galloping forward despite all barriers or difficulties. And you can see that in the verbs, because the verbs are actions of the body. And that is something that I have been very deliberate about kind of showing that in the verbs that I use to describe the actions of the mother and the daughter on this hike.
Your day job is as a psychiatrist and a psychoanalyst. And so, can you talk a little bit about how society and the greater world intersects with the bodies and health of those you care for?
Yeah. Yes, my day job informs my writing quite a bit. And I regularly see the interaction between the society and, I would say, history, and an individual's body and physical and mental health. If I wear my psychoanalyst hat for a moment, I would say that our bodies are the first points of contact with the other and the collective. And this interaction is bi-directional. So our bodies are the boundaries of what we experience as our individual self. And we might say that our body carries the whole host of our experiences, whether it's in the forms of emotions or memory or bodily pain, etc., or what we do to our bodies and things like that. And in that sense, it carries us and our history. But it is a permeable barrier in contact with the world. And so while it takes from the world, it also puts something out in the world that determines our interactions with the others. Say, for example, through the color of our skin or the size of our body and so on. And then that again comes to impact how we experience ourselves. So there's this constant back and forth. So the body bears the memories and the scars, but the body can also be a battleground. And that is something that I'm very familiar with through my own lived experiences as well. Bodies become battlegrounds when they're either invisible to the world or mistreated by the world through discrimination, for example, or control. I believe that one important way of controlling a person is through physically controlling their body, and that is accomplished through various means. It could be discipline, labor, but also what they're forced to wear and not to wear, and so on. So when the body is violated or restrained or oppressed, the subject struggles to maintain its agency and subjectivity. And that is something that we see in trauma and gender-based violence, as well as systemic oppression and so on. And these are all the kinds of things that I see in my line of work and I deal with all the time. So the body is implicated in many different ways.
I'm curious how this affects parenting. You have a young daughter, and you grew up in a country where the body was of women very much controlled. How does that influence how you interact with your daughter in a completely different world than the one you grew up in?
I think it impacts my relationship with my daughter quite a bit, in terms of what that perhaps, compared to other mothers, I might be a bit more sensitive, for example, about what I fostering that kind of autonomy and independence in her that maybe I wish that I was granted more of. I am very aware of giving her choices in terms of what she wants to wear, what she wants to do. Uh, uh, and I guess it plays out in many different ways, because you're always kind of thinking about, okay, how much of this is what I'm bringing from my own childhood, and how much of it is what she's experiencing. But I'm constantly battling with that in terms of of course, the limitations that you need to put as a parent, and freedom and choices.
And the body politic is also the sense of the collective, and dislocation from the collective has a profound effect on people's bodies. And it's also a powerful theme in literature. I think of writers like Jhumpa Lahiri, Alexander Solzhenitsyn's a whole kind of culture of writing about dislocation and body politic. And I'm wondering if you can talk about how this collective sense maybe plays a role in your writing or in your work.
Yeah. Uh, yeah, thank you for that question. Dislocation from the collective and how it is carried in the body, or how the body comes to represent it, definitely shows up in my writing. But I would say it differs in a crucial way from, for example, a writer like Jhumpa Lahiri, in that Lahiri has an affinity for her Bengali heritage, despite displacements and distances, and is still accessible to her, both physically and mentally. While I find myself in a state of complete detachment, actually, from my place of origin, because that space is not accessible anymore. Sometimes there's a sense that something has died, that's not retrievable. Maybe in the same way that the mother in this story cannot visit the grave of her own mother. Like the place of origin, the birthplace, is forever destroyed, and it is not possible to be visited any longer. So that, I think, is the flavor that carries through a lot of my writing. And in my stories, this shows up as anorexia, dementia, kind of wasting away, because the motherland cannot feed the body. And at the end of this story, that's why I wanted to read the ending, because we see this at the end with the mother, and how she's wasting away, and then how it's actually carried forward to the next generation. So that starvation is carried forward to the daughter, or the amnesia is carried forward to the daughter, where there's also something that she feels like has died or is dying.
Wow, those are powerful metaphors, or really embodiments. I think it's fascinating. I'd like to turn a little bit to craft right now. I'm always interested in writing craft, and you and I did some very intense editing with this story, and I'm wondering if you'd be amenable to sharing what was it like to have your creative work, presumably that you sweated over for years, now intersecting with some random editor's creative vision.
Yeah, we did some intense editing. It is always a challenge, because I'm very dedicated to the sounds of the language, and I'm particular, like I'm sure many writers are. But the editing process is also interesting, because it is a bit like having a dialogue. And it's interesting to me when something that I take for granted comes to be not so obvious to others. And especially when we're talking, when we're speaking from different places, or we're talking about a different society, different background, which in my work is definitely there. It is actually very helpful when an editor shares something that they're confused about, or ask a question, or ask for elaborations, because it helps me see how my work is seen through the eyes of the other, and it actually helps me see something that maybe to me I'm just blinded to it. It's my blind spot, because to me it's obvious, and to somebody else is not. So in that sense, it's actually, I find it to be interesting, and something that uh, can actually be fruitful in terms of figuring something out actually about the writing. But then I know there were some places that I felt strongly about that I didn't want to change. And, you were very supportive of that, which is great. But I think those places is more just maybe the tone of the language, or just a kind of connection that I make with certain sounds or certain phrases that to me, they feel like they're communicating something, although it might be hard for me to explain exactly why. So those were the places where I felt like I just feel like I want this to be here, even though not everybody might like it or might believe that it should be there.
Well, that's incredibly generous way of looking at it all, and I'll say it was a wonderful experience working with you.
Yeah.
What I really enjoyed about it is that you were very open to really considering different things. Not every writer feels comfortable having an outside person really push a little bit, but I think that, in my experience as an editor and as a writer, when people are open-minded to taking some chances with another way of expressing something, it really does bring the best out. But of course, we also feel strongly that we need to honor the writer's voice. So hopefully we kept that in for you. So thank you so much for going through this process. And lastly, what's next for you? What's on deck literarily?
So actually, what I'm doing right now, and this story is actually a part of that. I am actually working on a collection, and I have published some pieces of that collection, and this is going to be one of them. And this collection is mostly, actually, it is. A bit of a collage. Like it's a story, a collection of short stories, and it's a bit of a collage that put together paints a picture, not a complete picture, but fragmented picture of my experiences growing up in Iran, and then the process and the immigration and displacements, and also a lot of politics. Iranian society is a political society. There's a lot that's going on there, and reflecting some of that, and especially the recent movements in Iran with the women's rights movements in Iran are reflected in that. So that's the collection that I'm hoping to have, ready this year, and then see if I would have any success publishing it through a publisher. Yeah, so so this story is one of that collection. And the way the collection works is that even though the stories are not exactly related, but you would see different characters showing up over and over in the story, in the collection. Yeah, so
Well, we'll be very excited to read that collection. Thank you so much for sharing your time as well as your beautiful story with us.
thank you very much, Danielle. It was a pleasure talking to you as well.